In this tutorial, I'm going to discuss how you manage your encounters in Dungeon Builder. Specifically, we're going to be talking about four topics: how to generate encounters, how to edit your encounters once you've created them, how to use two encounter tools we have called the Previous Roles List and the Encounter Pick List, and we'll also take a look at the Encounter Battle Sheet. We're going to jump around a bit among these topics, but let's start off by looking at how to generate encounters. By now you should be familiar with both how to load your monsters into Dungeon Builder, as well as how to create your own encounter tables and then link those tables to dungeon levels. With that setup work out of the way, you're now ready to generate encounters, and Dungeon Builder gives you three ways to do that. Those three methods are set encounters, or what we call placed encounters, on-demand random monster encounters, and timed random monster encounters. Set encounters are encounters that are placed in the room. This can be done a couple of ways, but the principal method you will use is to click on the Generate Encounter button that appears on the Room Details dialog. And to show you what I mean by that, I'll open up a dungeon here. We'll pick the Barrow Downs, pick a level, and then I'll double click on Room 2 here. And this brings up the Room Details dialog. And all I do is I click on the Generate Encounter button. And notice at the same time that the encounter is being populated to this table in the center of the Room Details dialog, an icon is appearing in the room. This monster icon is a visual cue to the Game Master to alert him when he's in play mode that there's actually an encounter in that room. Now this encounter was rolled up using the encounter table that was associated with this level of the dungeon up on the encounter tab of the admin control panel. So when you associate an encounter table with a dungeon level, that table is being used for all encounters, random or otherwise. If you want to generate a set encounter with a tougher monster than the standard monsters for this level of the dungeon, you should use a tougher encounter table. We'll show you how to do this when we look at on-demand encounters. Okay, looking at this dialog, note that the list will show up to 8 monsters at a time. If you happen to generate an encounter with more than 8 monsters, an elevator is going to appear over here so you can scroll through them all. Also, if there are any associated monsters specified for the instant monster in this encounter, those associated monsters will also be rolled up and appear in this listing. You should also note that the summary experience for this encounter is displayed up here on the dialog. If you decide you don't want that encounter in the room, just click the Detach button and you delete it, and the M icon is removed from the map. On the other hand, if you want to see the details of a particular encounter, all you have to do is click on the Edit button. And this brings up the encounter details screen, which is a pretty powerful screen. The first thing you notice about it is this green table on the right that lists the monster's name, its hit point, armor class, and initiative, and it does this for each and every monster in the encounter. You see, each monster's hit points were automatically rolled when the encounter was generated based on the hit dice that are shown on the monster datasheet. Armor class was also pulled from the monster datasheet, and while initiative will always default to a 0 as it is here, if you set the switch to yes on the encounter tab, then initiative will be rolled using the D10 method for initiative. If you'd like to edit the details of a given monster, all you have to do is select one and then click on this Edit Monster button. This causes a hidden edit row to appear, and you can change the monster's name, his hit points, his armor class, his initiative, and his experience points. Note that when you first created the monster, Dungeon Builder automatically calculated experience based on the data for those monsters on the monster datasheet. However, when you manually change features using this edit row, such as armor class or hit points, the experience is not auto-adjusted, as we're not sure just what is being changed. It's also important when you make these changes that you save your changes in order to make sure that they're captured to the screen. So I'm going to change this from Ant Soldier to Ant Leader, and I'll give him a few extra hit points, and I'll raise his armor class, and I'll change his experience to, say 168. I'll save that. And notice how the experience points up here changes as well. Now, while the edit row is good for tweaking individual monsters in your encounter, if you want to make wholesale changes to your encounter, that is when you're going to want to use these add and remove arrow buttons. On the left-hand side is a listing of all the monsters in your database. And once again, this is for test purposes, so there's very few monsters in this database. But if you want to add one of these monsters to your current encounter, all you have to do is select the one you want, like I'll select an Ant Queen, and click on the Add button. And the Ant Queen is automatically rolled up and added to the encounter. Note that this Add Remove widget works somewhat differently than the one that you saw on the Encounter tab up on the Admin Control panel. On the Encounter tab, when you're creating your encounter tables, when you add a monster to your encounter table, you are adding the entire class of that monster so it is removed from this left-hand side listing and moved over to the right-hand side. This is to ensure that you don't get confused about which monsters you've added to your encounter table and which ones you haven't. However, in this case, all you're doing is adding individual monsters, which are instances of a monster type. And so what happens is when we click add, we generate an instance, an individual example of that monster type and add it to your encounter. But because you might want to add multiple instances of Ant Queen, we leave the Ant Queen monster type on this side. And if you want to remove a monster, all you do is select the one you want to remove and click remove. Another neat feature is the save or change location button. When you click on this button, Dungeon Builder presents a list of all the rooms in the current dungeon. Rooms that already have monsters in them will display the label for that particular encounter. Now what you can do with this list is that you can move your encounter to any room that does not already have an encounter in it. So I'm going to select the second level room 1 and I'm going to move the monster to that encounter. So remember that, second level room 1. And when I go down to the second level, notice that room 1 has an encounter in it, and it should have an Ant Queen in it. Let's take a look, and it does. It also has our Ant Leader. So I'm going to close out of that, and we go back up to the first level. It should have updated itself and taken the icon out of room 2, and it has. Now let's bring up another encounter in order to look at that last button on the encounter detail screen. And that button is Add to Encounter List. This moves the monster from the current room to something of a parking lot. The monster is saved, but is not assigned to a room. We'll talk more about the encounter list in just a moment. But before leaving the encounter detail screen, one last thing that I do want to call out for you is notice how the encounter name is editable, okay? You don't have to live with the default name for your encounter, which is just the monster label. You can say bunch of bears here and save it, and it will appear as a bunch of bears. You'll see that when we get to the encounter list. Let's now turn to our second method of generating encounters, rolling up on-demand random encounters. While set encounters are typically generated in advance of sitting down to play a session when you're in draw mode, on-demand random monster encounters are almost always generated during the session when you are in play mode. That said, while that is the norm, you can still use both the Generate Encounter button on the Room Details dialog as well as the on-demand random encounter methods during both draw and play modes. Now, as we'll see in a moment, the third method of using timed random monster encounters can only be done in play mode, but these other two modes, set encounters and on-demand random encounters, can be used in draw and play mode. Now, on-demand random encounters are those encounters that the GM just needs to whip up on the fly. This may be because he wants to nudge the party along or because the players are doing random wilderness or some other reason. In any event, when you want to generate an on-demand random monster encounter, you click on the Encounter tab up here in the Admin Control pane, and then on the Encounter sub-tab, and then you click on this monster head here. And what it will do is generate an automatic encounter based upon the current dungeon level that you are on. And here we come up with 4 wolves. I'm going to close this down a second because I wanted to show you that this feature, this on-demand random monster encounter, only works when you're on a dungeon level map. For example, if I'm on another tab like monsters, okay, and I click on the monster head, it doesn't do anything, okay? The same is true for dungeons or character, okay? It doesn't generate an encounter. And the reason why is that Dungeon Builder needs to know what encounter table to use, and it determines that based upon the map that is showing up in the playing pane. So once you have a map selected, the monster head works and you get your on-demand random monster encounter. However, what is neat about using the on-demand encounter button is that it presents this encounter dialog, which is not the same as the encounter details dialog. You can get to the encounter details dialog by clicking on this button here, but this is actually a higher level, more powerful screen than the encounter details. There's several things that you can do here that you can't do on the encounter details dialog. For example, you can change the encounter table that you want to use for generating your encounter. So although the default encounter table for this level was used, I can easily change the encounter table to a different one. I only have 3 right now because I haven't built up a lot of encounter tables. But I can easily change it to any one of these encounter tables and then re-roll the encounter and come up with 4 angel princes, which is a far cry from 6 wolves. I think I'll go back to barrel level 1 and re-roll. Now, whether you change the encounter table or not, You can re-roll this encounter up to 20 times while on the screen. Moreover, if you want to go back and look at those previous rolls, all you have to do is click on this Show Previous Rolls button. And here are all the different encounters that you just rolled. Okay? And then if you want, you can recall one of these encounters just by double-clicking on it. And it creates that encounter. And now those 4 ants show up in the Encounter Details dialog. Let me close out of this and bring up another encounter. Now, before looking at some of the other buttons on the screen, I want to call out that this Previous Rolls widget pops up in circumstances where a random event is taking place. Right now we're dealing with encounters, but this also appears in other situations as well. And what it is for is that it allows you to quickly call up a bunch of alternative results, encounters in this case, that you can choose from if you don't like the original outcome that was presented. You can do the same thing with die cups when you re-roll die cups. But what is important to note about the Previous Rolls list is that this is a temporary list and it is restricted to the current circumstances. When you end the draw session that you are presently in, because you've logged out of Dungeon Builder or because you've started a play session, the Previous Rolls list gets cleaned out. Everything is dumped. So it's not carried over from one session to the next. And secondly, while the Previous Rolls will show those items that are pertaining to the current session, it is restricted to just those items of the type that you are rolling up previous rolls for, i.e. encounters or rolling up a character or rolling up dice in a dice cup. You won't see a list of all the different previous rolls of all different types of previous rolls, just the ones that pertain to a certain type, in this case, encounters. Now, everything I've set up to this point for previous rolls is in contrast to our next button here, which is adding to the encounter list. While the Previous Rolls list is temporary, the encounter list is a permanent storage for all your encounters within that dungeon. When you click on this button, the encounter is silently saved to an encounter list behind the scenes. Let's go take a look at that encounter list. It's right here on the same tab as the on-demand random monster encounter. I'll click on that, and as you can see, it presents a list of encounters with their name, their size, the level of the dungeon they are on, as well as the room number if they're assigned to a room. But not all encounters that are saved to the encounter list will be assigned to a room. By the way, here's that bunch of bears that we were talking about. It's in room 3. Remember we changed the name on that? Now, regarding these monsters that have a room location of none, that means these monsters have been stored for later use, but they have not been placed in the room. So while they are stored, they are not set encounters. That said, as you can tell by this listing of buttons down here, all you have to do in order to view or place or delete an encounter is to select the encounter you want from this list. I'll select these angel princes on the first level room 5 and I'll detach them, and notice how the room goes to none. And yes, you guessed it, the detach function works similar to the button of the same name that you saw on the room detail screen. It breaks the association of the encounter to a particular room and sets the room to none. It'll also remove the monster icon from the room. I'm not going to show you that right now, but it did pull the M out of there. But the great thing about this encounter list is that unlike previous rolls encounters, these encounters are permanently saved until you delete them. So you can log out, go into a different session, come back later on, and they will still be there. The last button that you see here is the print button, and this allows you to print out an encounter battle sheet. It is identical to the print button on the on-demand random monster encounter screen, which we were looking at a moment ago. Let me show you that once again. Here's the printer button here. And while we're talking about printing monsters, how about we look at the encounter battle sheet? But to understand the encounter battle sheet, we need to step back a moment and understand that combat is not directly supported in Dungeon Builder. Remember, we want to accelerate the tabletop gaming experience. We're not looking to replace it. And in this release of Dungeon Builder, we drew the line of how far we wanted to go by allowing the GM to print out the encounter on a clean encounter battle sheet. We didn't want to automate the process of managing combat. And what that means, though, is that he or she will still have to track damage for the monsters on that battle sheet. He won't have to spend the time figuring out what the monster is and determining the number and rolling up the hit points and the experience. All that will be done for him. But he will have to print out the battle sheet and then play off of that. Okay, that said, when you click on the print button, Dungeon Builder automatically generates a PDF that is pre-formatted to make it easy for you to track your monsters and the damage they receive during battle. And here we have 12 orcs. Let me blow this up a bit for you. Now you can either print this PDF off and play off the piece of paper, or you can copy and paste this to a spreadsheet and track it in Excel or Google Docs. It's really up to you what you want to do here. But this gives you a feel for what the document will look like. And as you can see, in addition to printing the encounter name up here, as well as the dungeon that you're in, which is the Barrow Downs, and the level of that dungeon, it will also print, if appropriate, the room number. Right now it's an on-demand encounter, so it won't print the room number. And it will also provide you the total experience for this particular encounter, as well as key data on each and every monster in this encounter. So for all 12 orcs, we have their experience, their armor class, their initiative, which is 0 because it's the default unless you set the initiative flag to yes, and the hit points associated with that monster. This will make it a lot easier to account for monsters that run away by just debiting their experience points from the total encounter experience points. You'll also notice how the hit points are listed over here on the right-hand side. That's done on purpose in order to make it easier for you to mark off hit points as the monsters receive damage. Now you may be wondering why we have 2 total experience fields here. That is because the total experience is really just a subtotal for this instant monster. If an associated monster had been defined on the encounter tab for the orc, then we might have had several of those associated monsters as well. For example, wolves. And then there would be a subtotal for the associated monster, and we have to add the 2 subtotals, one for the orcs, one for the wolves, together to get the overall encounter total experience. Now, while we have 12 monsters here, don't worry if your encounter happens to generate 50 or more monsters. Dungeon Builder will just add more pages to the battle sheet. And that's it on the battle sheet. Okay, our last topic is how to generate timed random monster encounters. Timed random monster encounters are triggered by incrementing the Dungeon Builder game clock over here. Now, there is no game clock in action right now because we're not in a session. Let me fix that by starting an adventure. I will pick up the Thieves' Den and I will start that adventure. And we'll talk about all the various things that go on behind the scene when you start an adventure when we get to the play tutorial. But okay, so we've gone through the gyrations here, and now the game clock has presented itself, and we are back to picking a dungeon that is associated with this adventure. I'll go back to the Barrow Downs, even though this particular adventure is tied to the Thieves. Once again, it doesn't matter what dungeon you pick. It doesn't have to match the session name that you posted on the adventure. What I'm going to do is I'm going to reset my clock back to 0, and I'm ready to begin. Now, we talk about the game clock at length in the time tutorial, so I won't repeat that material here. However, what you should know here is that you can increment the game clock either directly by using the up arrow or the plus button, or by moving the party icon on the map. Either method will have the same effect of advancing game time and triggering encounter checks. I'm going to place the party icon on the map here just to put that to the test. As you may recall, for this particular level, the first level of the Barrow Downs, we identified as having a frequency of checking for encounters every 8 rounds and a 40% chance of an encounter. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to advance the game time 8 turns, which will be 10 random monster checks, so I should get 4 encounters if I'm lucky. There's 8 turns. You should ask me to confirm that. It does. And it rolled 4 encounters. That's pretty good. And then I can check what those encounters are. Now this is a good example because I wanted to show you the screen here. It shows you something that can happen when you're incrementing the game clock directly. This doesn't happen so often when you move the party icon. But you can get multiple encounters when you increment the game clock. You see, in this case, we got 4 encounters by advancing the game clock 8 turns. Suppose I advance the game clock a month, okay? That could lead to literally hundreds of encounters. Now, we've placed a governor with inside Dungeon Builder to prevent this, and it only allows you to roll up to 20 encounters at once, no matter how much you increment the game clock in a single incrementation, okay? That way it prevents you from tying up resources on the server and denying other people access to their sessions. But the fact remains that you can easily end up with multiple encounters, and this is the screen that allows you to choose which encounter among all those encounters you can play. All you do is figure out which one you like and double click on it, and you'll get the encounter detail screen. And there you go. And believe it or not, that completes this tutorial on how to manage your encounters. Thanks for watching.